So one of the worst things that happened about getting older and getting more experience and seeing things play out in the world was realizing just how much I was wrong based on sort of my ideological orientation. That was not my favorite. Did not enjoy it. 0 out of 10. Not a fan. However, that's how you can test how accurate your model of reality is when you see things unfold over time, whether or not you were correct or not, and how close you were to being correct kind of gives you an idea of like how good your model is. And so what I realized was that everyone essentially had half of the model that works and half of a model that is dangerous and unsafe toward other people. So I'm speaking for American politics. I can't speak to any other country's politics. So I want to preface that by saying that. However, so I just for background info, I grew up as a very, very, very liberal, progressive person. And so, one of the things that I didn't realize, as I was young and sort of forming my ideas of the world, I didn't realize that these were essentially their own religions. Whenever you get together with someone, and this is progressive or conservatives, if that is your group, if that's your in group, when people get together to talk about ideas and topics, they always do what in my mind I call like, okay, we're doing the Pledge of Allegiance. So if you're a conservative and you finally realize like Donald Trump is terrible, and you get together with other conservatives, you're going to get together with them and you might say, well, okay, so I voted for Donald Trump, but, right? You've done the Pledge of Allegiance, but now you want to talk about whatever the issue is. And progressives do it too. I believe in trans rights, but I believe in government programs, but, right? We have to qualify what we're about to say by doing the little Pledge of Allegiance. Or if it's a news story that we want to talk about, by we I mean people, human beings, everybody, we'll qualify it by saying, I believe blah blah blah, but right. So you do the Pledge of Allegiance to your group before you bring up the concerns. And I've mentioned this in another video. I learned about something called compaction cycles that lead to radicalization from someone who writes. Her website is she's Prester Jane, and essentially the idea is that like a group has a set of ideas, and so pulls in sort of a coalition of everyone who agrees. But then everybody starts rules lawyering at each other, and healthy people basically kind of go, oh, this seems extra, I don't like this. And so they'll back out of that group, leaving the least healthy members to then continue to rules lawyer at each other. And so the group gets more and more radicalized and smaller until they're entirely out of pocket and unhinged and a little delulu. And so when I have talked about this in past videos, I was talking about this in terms of estranged parent forums, estranged parents. But this applies to any group, any system. The people who desire to dominate others will start to dominate others and will be highly conflict oriented. And so people who aren't interested in that will take themselves out of the group. And then you stop having those dissenting voices. And when you stop having the dissenting voices, you do quickly move into abusive territory or high control territory where everyone is, if you don't believe this, you're bad and wrong. And this is systems of people, period. They all seem to fall into this. And at this point, I'm over it. I'm so tired. I'm tired in life. So when you grow up in a system and you see from the inside how people misuse that system, people's natural response is often to overcorrect into the exact opposite thing. And so this is why victims of abuse run into trouble, because they had abusive parents. And so they think, okay, I'm a parent now. And I don't want to be like that. So I'm going to do the exact opposite thing. And the problem is that the exact opposite thing often teaches your children not to respect you. And I don't mean the respect authoritarian, you have to blah, blah, blah. Not that one. I mean the respect for you as a human being. Because a lot of the time, victims of abuse will overcorrect into, I have to be endlessly nurturing and loving no matter what horrible stupid things my kids do. And sometimes you got to come in and you got to be firm and you got to use business voice, and there has to be consequences, and it doesn't make you abusive. But if we haven't healed our relationship with power, that can be very hard to do because it feels like being mean or being like our abusive parents. Or it can also be something of like of a trap, because we're afraid that if we do that, then we're justifying the abuse that we experienced. And so in order to not do that, we may continue to act in these very ineffective ways that also don't emphasize respect, because that word has been misused and as a concept has been weaponized against victims. So often we overcorrect to the other thing. Well, this end stage monstrosity of capitalism is terrible, so socialism must be the thing. And then so everybody gets into their little camps and groups, and then they are ideologically fighting with the opposing side, and then also within the group we're compacting now and more radicalizing. And again, every group, everybody does this. People love to rules lawyer at each other. It's so, I now that I've recognized it, I see it everywhere. Everybody's doing it. And so we're doing it in relationships and we're doing it in politics. We're doing it everywhere. So one of the things that I think people misunderstand about politics is that not all governments need all policies at all times. So when people are trying to construct these rules frameworks of this is how it works, not everything is for every period in a government's iteration. So, for example, if you want to have programs that help people, there is a point in a government's trajectory and a timeline, let's say, where that is not going to cause problems yet. There's sort of this balance that has to happen. And I had to learn about economics, and I did not enjoy it. I didn't want to know about this. But you can't understand history unless you understand the finances of it all. So anyway, if the government does something and the government spends money, 100% it causes inflation every single time. Conservatives are correct about that. Yeah, that sucked. I didn't love that. The problem is the system can take some of that before it gets to a point where there's either too many programs or too much inflation, and now we've overburdened the system, right? So conservatives are wrong when they say you should never have programs, because they have programs. They have programs for people that they care about. It's just a different set of people and a different set of problems. So for example, like farm subsidies. Farmers are receiving money, subsidies, whatever, and that does cause inflation, causes downstream issues, right? So it isn't that the programs cause problems, it's who do we think needs it, and are we willing to deal with that inflation, and can the system handle the amount of inflation that it will cause, right? So now I've moved more broadly to a systems perspective. So instead of, because we want to rules lawyer at each other, we need programs, or programs are bad. Like, depends on where we are in the system, and like what are the other balancing factors, and what tolerance does the system have, in this direction. There does, however, get to a point, especially when you're kind of like toward the end of a government, an iteration of a government, where there's now not only too many programs, but too many regulations, and it's too complex to kind of like do anything. But we built those regulations up piece by piece because they were written in blood, essentially. So people want to have a static perspective of governments and of ideologies, and they adhere to it in a very religious sense. And I think that's the wrong way to approach it. So when I see people kind of having these slap fights at each other, I don't think I don't think progressives understand conservatives and why they're like this. The reason why, in my opinion, there is a rural city dynamic, rural urban dynamic, is because conservatives are often living in rural areas, and they're often doing kind of like blue collar type of jobs. Your farmers, your plumbers, your whatever. And so if you're a farmer and you wake up at 4 a.m. and they wake up at horrible early hours, just crazy hours. There's a reason why people leave the country and go into the city to get a job, because it's hard work. So you're a farmer and you get up at 4 a.m. and you ignore every ache and pain in your body and you just get to it, right? And also, before the internet, before a phone in our pocket, there really wasn't a lot of media. The only consistent media that a rural person would have access to would be AM radio, because AM radio, the wavelength travels long distances. So you could have a radio station covering a huge, vast distance. So if you're a truck driver, you're a farmer, and you need something to listen to entertain yourself while you're doing these, manual labor kind of things, and being very proficient and taking care of, yourself and your family and other people's things, you are steeped in this perspective of self empowerment, of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, because that's your day-to-day experience. And so when you hear, in your mind, kids in the city who don't know nothing about nothing talking about anxiety, it just is not going to register to this group of people. On the flip side, if you have this inability to put yourself in someone's shoes, and you kind of just think they're just, they just need to get to work, right? Then one day maybe it's you. Maybe one day you're the one, you've been injured, can't farm anymore. There's nobody else on the farm to help you farm. You can't get workers to like help you. Well, then what? Or a tornado comes through, or a natural disaster, or something where you need help. Now, this is where conservatives will often get into I deserve the help because I work very hard. And so this is what the government is for. And again, some of that's correct. Some of that is not, who are we empathizing with? Whose problems are real? Who matters, right? So progressives on the other side, they don't really understand how this person has evolved, and they end up kind of vilifying that person. If especially when it comes to social justice issues, which most of the social justice people, like people who fall under this umbrella, have moved to the cities because that's where other people like you are. So the farmer is out in the middle of nowhere, kind of interacting with the same, 40 people or whatever group of people it is. And it's not present. This is not anything that they see in life. And especially if you work with animals, a lot of, you're going to think like, this doesn't make sense to me. Now, if you are a social justice person and you are progressive, progressives, I think, make a different mistake. Their mistake is in thinking that anybody who is vulnerable is somebody who's innocent. And that is not true. So I think my best example of this is hoarders. So hoarding is abusive, like period, point blank. And I understand that victims of abuse, as some victims of abuse, as a part of their trauma and how they are coping is that hoarding mechanism. But when you involve other people, you're now abusive, even if you didn't intend to be. And so I find that progressives are really terrible at kind of navigating this specific issue where they've identified a vulnerable person and they want to like reduce the stigma about it, because how can this person get help if they can't, you know, take ownership of it, and not just have it be like this deep dark secret they don't tell anybody about. How can they get help and support unless they're able to come forward? But the problem is, right, we are not holding people accountable for harmful actions they are doing. So I've seen, so it's hoarders, it's people who are homeless. And I say that I've had homeless people in my house. I've driven homeless people places. I I am getting calls right now from someone who is homeless, who is in jail. So I find the progressive stuff a very romanticized idea of like, as soon as they identify someone as a victim, they are no longer interested in having that person take accountability. And you end up with a problematic situation because you've interrupted the feedback loop of what helps people take accountability and move toward being safe. You can be a vulnerable person and be unsafe and harm others. Both of those things can be true. And I find that conservatives struggle with that because they're just like, this person's not safe. You know, and they're bad, making bad decisions. And on the progressive side, they're like, well, it's not their fault. And so they shouldn't experience any consequences because they had such a bad, experience. And, there's this immutable characteristic that's not their fault, right? So mental illness is a good example. But if you're dealing with mental illness, as another example, you can be a vulnerable person, you can even have been a victim, and you can also be unsafe towards others. So holding all of those things is very difficult for people to do. And what they'd prefer to do is to go into their individual separate camps and then rules lawyer at each other about what a good person is. And so we're kind of, that's why we have this swing in America between policies, and we go on one side, one set of 4 years, and then we often swing to the other side. So for example, if you have young people that are disadvantaged and they are turning toward crime. So if you're conservative, you're going to be like, well, don't choose to do the crime, do the time, right? That's kind of the attitude. If you're on a progressive side, you're looking at it and you're going, well, I see how we got here. And it's not their fault. We shouldn't be punishing these people for the situation in which they grew up. But then the problem is they don't experience consequences. And so they don't correct the behavior and they continue to move forward in like unsafe ways. And then you end up with a crime problem. And then people within that community swing back over to tough on crime. So that's why we have a swing between tough on crime and then a more social justice orientation towards crime. Again, to me, it's a system. I'm watching us do this over and over again. I'm now older and I'm like, oh my gosh, no one has a clue on the totality of it all. Okay. I'm going to be spicy. If you are someone who is trans, I would not watch forward from this point. You may find this triggering and I don't want to trigger you. So I just, I want us all to engage in self-care. And I just want to like put this out there for anyone so that they can click off if they need to. Also, if you are conservative and you're hoping for talking points against trans people, no, we're not doing that. Trans people are people, okay? And we love them too. So what I have seen around the trans issue is very bad boundaries. So that muddles the issue for having those broader social justice protections. And I'm not talking about stuff like bathroom stuff. There's legitimate safety concerns for people who are trans that no one seems to walk them through. And so they are often being unsafe towards others, especially potential partners. And so because I'm in the abuse community and I'm watching this and I'm like, oh my God, okay, how do we navigate this without adding to the burdens that someone who is trans is experiencing? So for example, if we're trans and we're stealing someone else's clothes and we're stealing their identity and their self-expression, it's not safe. It's not okay. In that desire to explore one's identity, a lot of people who are trans are starting close. And so imagine you're this person's sibling or you're their partner, and all of a sudden someone is taking your clothes and basically attempting to be you. That's extremely damaging on a soul destruction level. And so sometimes I'll see progressives kind of thread this needle by saying, well, this person is more in need. And it's like, you don't, it's not safe. Let's not do that. There are other ways to accomplish this. When I was a kid, we'd like go through magazines, and then you go to the thrift store and you'd get some things and you'd like try it out and you'd be like, oh, this doesn't work for me. Now there's the internet. You can just go on the internet and you can buy cheap things from China. So there's a way to accomplish what you want to do without being destructive to others. Yeah. And so anyway, there's like, I could talk about that more, but I'm not going to. But anyway, so when I'm looking at politics and I'm looking at people, I'm looking at people who get very entrenched in a specific set of ideas that they then rules lawyer at each other, and depending on who's in power shows which group gets in power. But the problem is it's the most extreme people in that group who then start executing, right, with no kind of governor on the system, because you aren't a real blah 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 if you don't think every single thing, if you have any kind of dissent or concern or something. And so we're naturally moving to extremes over time. And really the media landscape has very much fostered a whole lot of this. So when I'm looking at, when I'm looking at systems, I am looking for, can these concepts work together? Can we look at it and go, you know what? Sometimes people do need to take action on their own behalf, and we can have that from an empathetic perspective. And then also, though, we can recognize there are some things that are just how they are, and people are factually in a position where they're disadvantaged for no reason of their own. I think weight is really a good way to think about this. There are societal structures and reasons why, as a culture gets more wealthy, cultures tend to get bigger and bigger, like the people within that culture. And also we are personally making choices that kind of move us in that direction as well. Both of those things are true, and I find people really struggle with that. And so you can be in a position where you recognize, oh, we have a wider situation, and also there are individual reasons and decisions people are making. I like to think about Michael Phelps. Michael Phelps, incredible Olympian. He spends hours and hours and hours and hours a day swimming underwater, alone with his thoughts, swimming. And you have to be intrinsically oriented to be able to do that. You have to be a person who doesn't need maybe some kind of outside stimulation. It's not just that Michael Phelps is built the way that he's built. He intrinsically loves to do the thing that he's good at. And so he just does it more. And other people are not going to be able to replicate that because maybe it takes a certain kind of mind to be able to do that for hours and hours and hours a day. And so whenever you're struggling with something about yourself and you think, why this thing is bad and I hate it, there's probably something that it allows you to do that other people can't. And also, whenever you look at somebody who seems to be very successful and they're sitting here like, oh, it's so easy, all you do is blah, blah, blah. And it's like, they legitimately could be just intrinsically oriented to not having a problem with that thing. And it doesn't mean that you're a failure. It means you're wired differently. So our lack of empathy people struggle with that one. And so you can recognize, like, oh, I'm wired to struggle with this particular thing. And also, maybe there's a positive thing that comes out of it. And also, like, that's our own particular challenge. And so we can recognize the factors, and we can also recognize that we do maybe need to take some action about it. Not because it's our fault, but because we're the only one who can. Anyway, I hope this makes sense. And I'll talk to you next time.